My brother thought he was finally the pride of the family, so he invited everyone to his graduation except me. When I asked why he didn't hesitate, he said he didn't want the disgrace there. My mom agreed without looking up. My dad only shrugged like it wasn't his problem. I didn't argue, I didn't explain. I stayed quiet and let them believe whatever story made them comfortable. 2 weeks later, my brother walked into a job interview that was supposed to change his life, confident, certain, and completely unprepared for what he was about to see. I was already sitting there. The HR manager smiled, turned to him and said, "Before we begin, meet our CEO." He turned around, and in that moment, everything he thought he knew about me shattered. It started with a text I wasn't supposed to see. A notification blinked on my screen while I waited in line for coffee, and for once, I tapped into the family group chat out of sheer boredom. Final list for Evan's graduation dinner. Please RSVP. The message wasn't meant for me. I scrolled through the names without thinking. Cousins, aunts, uncles, even grandma who hadn't left the house for anything other than hospital visits in the last 6 months. She was listed. I wasn't. Not a typo, not a mistake. Just not there. I stared at the message longer than I should have. My name wasn't forgotten. It had been intentionally excluded. I typed back, "Was I left off on purpose?" Evan replied almost immediately, "Yeah, I didn't think you'd want to come anyway." I felt that familiar weight behind his words, the kind that didn't care whether it cut. "Why?" I asked. And then came the truth. "I don't want the disgrace of the family at my celebration." It didn't sting. Not the way he probably expected it to. It felt rehearsed, like he'd said it before. Maybe to Mom, maybe even to Dad, maybe even in that same chat. I imagined their faces while he said it. Mom nodded in agreement, glasses perched low, barely looking up. Dad shrugging like this wasn't new, like he didn't want to pick sides, but always somehow ended up on the same one. I walked into the kitchen that evening, phone still in hand, the message still glowing on the screen. Mom was peeling carrots like nothing had happened. Dad was half asleep in front of the TV. "I saw the guest list," I said. Calm, measured. She didn't look up. "It's Evan's day. He gets to invite who he wants." "And you agreed." She finally met my eyes. "Don't make this into something bigger than it is. He's worked hard. Don't take that from him." Dad, without moving his gaze from the TV, muttered, "Some people just don't fit into those kinds of moments. Let it go, Violet." I realized in that moment what they were really saying. It was easier this way, easier for them, easier to cut me out than deal with what I made them feel. I wasn't their daughter anymore. I was a complication. I didn't respond. I didn't cry. I didn't ask them to reconsider. I simply turned, walked away, and closed the door behind me. That night, the group chat lit up with conversations I wasn't part of. Someone offered to bring dessert. Someone else joked about Evan wearing his cap backward. And somewhere between the stream of emojis and laughter, I caught a message I wasn't supposed to see. "Just make sure she doesn't show up. You know how she is." Followed by Evan's reply, "Trust me, she knows better." They didn't just expect me to stay away. They counted on it. My silence was their convenience. I was the scapegoat that made the rest of them look clean. I'd learned a long time ago that arguing didn't change minds. Not in this house. Not with them. I wasn't going to convince anyone that I deserved to be there. I wasn't going to rewrite the story they'd already agreed to believe, so I said nothing. But I watched. I listened. And I remembered. While they were planning Evan's big day, I was working. Not that they asked what I did anymore. Somewhere along the way, my career became just another uncomfortable subject, something they avoided like politics at the dinner table. I'd stopped offering details. They'd stopped pretending to care. But that week I had meetings to prepare for. Important ones. On Thursday, a name crossed my desk. Familiar. Too familiar. Evan Thompson. Scheduled for an executive interview. A high-stakes position at a company he'd been bragging about for months. I stared at the resume for a second too long. Then I handed it to my assistant and said, "Schedule him for Friday morning. I'll take the meeting." Friday came faster than expected. Evan arrived early. I could hear his voice outside the conference room, joking with the receptionist, radiating that self-assured charm that had always earned him praise. I waited perfectly still behind the frosted glass door. When the HR manager walked in, he gave me a quick nod, then turned to Evan and said, "Before we begin, I'd like you to meet our CEO." Evan turned. His smile dropped. His face was drained of color. He opened his mouth, maybe to speak, maybe to laugh it off, but nothing came out. I looked him in the eye. Hold it. Let him see everything I wasn't allowed to be in that living room at that dinner table on that guest list. Not angry, not bitter, just undeniable. And at that moment I saw it, the truth sinking into his eyes. Everything he believed about me, every story he told to make himself the hero, collapsed. They thought leaving me out would keep things simple. They had no idea I was about to step into the one room where silence finally meant something. The first time I remember being asked to step aside for the sake of peace, I was 12 and standing in a crowded living room that smelled like takeout and furniture polish. The kind of family gathering that was supposed to feel warm, but always made me feel like I was in the way. We were celebrating something small, an anniversary, a promotion it hardly mattered. My brother had just spilled a drink on the carpet. It wasn't a big spill, just enough to darken the fabric and make everyone tense for half a second. My aunt laughed it off. My mom rushed for paper towels. My dad waved his hand like it was nothing. Then someone glanced at me standing a little too quietly near the doorway and said, "Violet, can you move? You're crowding him." I remember stepping back without thinking, even though I hadn't touched anything, even though I was nowhere near the stain. No one noticed. The moment passed, the night continued. It was subtle, almost polite, and that was the point. No one had raised their voice. No one had been cruel. Everything had made sense if you didn't look too closely. That was how it always started. As the years went on, the language became familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. "You're more mature," my mom would say when my brother got upset and someone needed to bend. "You understand, right?" My dad would add, already halfway out of the conversation. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." They said it with smiles, with a tone that implied trust, as if they were giving me something instead of taking it away. Being the bigger person sounded like praise when I was younger. It took me a long time to realize it was just another way of asking me to disappear. Every conflict had a solution that looked the same. I would adjust. I would wait. I would swallow whatever I was feeling, so someone else didn't have to feel uncomfortable. My brother learned that if he pushed hard enough, someone would cushion the fall for him. I learned that if I didn't make noise, the room stayed calmer. We were both rewarded for our roles, just in very different ways. When my brother messed up, there was always a reason. He was stressed. He was under pressure. He didn't mean it that way. When I did nothing at all, there was still a problem, and somehow it belonged to me. If the mood shifted, it was because I was off. If someone was irritated, it was because I was being weird. I learned early that emotions didn't need evidence. They just needed direction. And mine was always convenient. No one ever sat me down and said, "This is what's happening." There were no family meetings, no dramatic declarations. There was just a quiet consensus that formed around me like fog, thick enough that I could feel it, thin enough that I couldn't point to it without being accused of imagining things. The favoritism wasn't loud, it was efficient. So I adapted. I didn't leave the family, I didn't rebel or storm out or cut anyone off. I simply became smaller. I talked less at dinners. I arrived later and left earlier. I shared fewer details, not because I was hiding, but because no one ever seemed interested in holding them. I learned which topics earned blank stares and which ones earned polite discomfort, and I stopped bringing them up. I smiled at the right moments. I laughed when I was supposed to. I made myself easy to be around, and the reward was immediate. The house felt calmer when I spoke less. The tension lowered when I asked for nothing. My parents relaxed into it, grateful without ever saying thank you. And over time, my quietness stopped being noticed at all. It became the baseline, something they expected without realizing they were expecting it. Eventually, my silence started to mean things it never did. "She's fine," my mom would say when someone asked where I was. "She doesn't need much." My dad liked to tell people I was independent, like it was a personality trait instead of a survival skill. They spoke about me as if I were self-sustaining, as if my lack of needs absolved them from checking in. No one asked if I was actually okay with being left out of decisions. No one asked if I wanted more space or less. They interpreted my absence as contentment, my quiet as strength. It was easier that way. It meant they didn't have to look at the pattern forming right in front of them. I wasn't just sacrificing anymore. I was being erased gently, lovingly, with their full confidence that this was the best arrangement for everyone. There was one time I tried to change it. I don't even remember what sparked it, just that I was tired and had finally reached the point where the words slipped out before I could stop them. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't yell. I simply said no to something I was expected to agree to, and then when pressed, I explained why. The room went quiet in that way that feels heavier than shouting. My mom's face tightened. My dad sighed like I'd inconvenienced him. My brother laughed sharp and dismissive and said, "See, this is what I'm talking about." The labels came fast after that, sensitive, difficult, making things awkward. I watched the way their shoulders relaxed when I eventually backed down the relief that flooded the room as soon as I returned to my place. That was the moment it clicked. Speaking up didn't just fail to help, it actively made things worse. For them. And that meant it would always be framed as my fault. By the time I reached adulthood, the role was set. I was the one who absorbed the friction so it didn't spread, the one who adjusted so others didn't have to. It was so ingrained that even I started to believe it was just who I was. Quiet, low maintenance, easy. I told myself I preferred it this way. I told myself it kept the peace. But after everything that happened, after watching how quickly they accepted a version of me that made exclusion feel justified, I started looking back at those moments with clearer eyes. I saw the pattern not as a series of isolated incidents, but as a system that had been running smoothly for years. I wasn't unlucky. I was useful. And usefulness in that family was measured by how little space you took up. Now, in the quiet after the fallout, I wasn't asking myself what I'd done wrong. I wasn't replaying conversations, searching for a better way to phrase things. I was noticing how rarely anyone had asked what I wanted or who I was, or whether I needed something different. They didn't know me, not really. Not because I was secretive, but because curiosity had never been part of the arrangement. They had a version of me that worked for them, and they stuck with it. And for the first time, I understood that I didn't owe them a correction. I didn't owe them clarity or reassurance, or a revised narrative that made them more comfortable. I could let them keep believing whatever they needed to believe. I could keep my silence not as a sacrifice, but as a choice. I used to think staying quiet kept the peace. Now I am starting to understand. It just taught them how little space I was allowed to take. It started with a voicemail I wasn't meant to hear. I'd called my mom earlier that day, out of habit, not hope, and she didn't pick up. A small act, like pushing on a door you already knew was locked. Later that afternoon, she called back. The signal dropped before I could answer. A moment later, the voicemail icon blinked on my screen. I tapped it without thinking, expecting a clipped "call me back" or something mundane about Aunt Celia's latest knee surgery. Instead, I heard her voice, soft, familiar in the worst way, talking to someone else. She's always been like that. She said, the sound of dishes clinking faintly in the background. Violet just pulls away. We stop trying after a while. It's not personal. A pause. Then another voice, lighter, amused. Maybe my aunt responded, "I thought you two were close." My mother chuckled, casual and short. She means well, but she makes things tense, you know. They laughed. Not sharply, not cruelly, just lightly, like they were commenting on traffic or a neighbor's loud dog. I stood in my kitchen, hand still gripping the phone, staring at the speckled countertop. I didn't press pause. I didn't replay it. I didn't call her back. The days after passed like fog. Not anger exactly, but a kind of internal disorientation, like someone had tilted the frame of every memory just enough that nothing hung straight anymore. Suddenly, every past conversation came with new subtitles. Apparently, I wasn't just distant. I had chosen to be. I made things hard, not by saying anything, but by existing in a way that was already too much. They hadn't accused me. That's what made it work so well. No dramatic scenes, no harsh words, just small revisions until the story shifted and I was no longer recognizable. She chose her own path. I heard my dad say that in another call I wasn't meant to catch. I'd walked into the living room to grab a folder and froze at the sound of my name. We didn't push her away, he said. She just became distant, focused on her career. Then after a pause, almost like a conclusion, she's always been different. Different. Distant. Not wrong. Not mistreated. Just gone. I remembered being 17 watching my brother crash our second car after sneaking out drunk. He was grounded for the weekend, then given a new one before Christmas. I remembered being 19, staying out late with friends and missing a few calls. When I got home, my mother was on the stairs in tears, telling anyone who would listen, "She doesn't care about this family. She shuts us out." The pattern wasn't new, but hearing it aloud from the outside looking in felt like discovering I'd been acting in a script someone else had written for me. My brother didn't lie. He curated. He'd say I don't know what else to do with a shrug and a sigh. People filled in the rest. "You're so patient," they'd say. "It must be hard having a sister like that." My parents didn't correct it. They reinforced it gently. "She's independent," my dad would explain. "She doesn't need us like Evan does." And if someone looked unsure, my mom would soften it. "You know how she is. Always intense, always in her head." They weren't slandering me. They were rounding me down, softening my shape until I no longer had one. And after a while, I started to believe them. Maybe I was too much. Maybe I pulled away too quickly. Maybe I didn't try hard enough. I combed through old texts, reread old arguments, looking for something, anything that justified the story they told. Then I found the message, buried in an old group chat with my cousin Lucas, one I hadn't opened in years. My brother had typed, "She flipped out last year because no one invited her to Dad's birthday thing. But we talked about it in front of her and she didn't say anything. I don't know what she wants." My heart slowed. I remembered that day, standing in the backyard. Evan and my parents talking by the grill, laughing about who'd bring what to dinner that Friday. They didn't say it outright, but it was clear who was coming. I smiled. I pretended I didn't notice. Friday came. I went anyway. Brought a bottle of wine. No one asked how I was. No one offered a chair. There were extra seats, but not one for me. I stood plate in one hand, ate quietly. When I left early, no one followed. I never mentioned it. Not once. And now that silence has become the proof of my volatility, my irrationality, my refusal to participate. That was the moment it all clicked. I hadn't been misunderstood. I'd been rewritten. They didn't just leave me out. They filled the space I left with a version of me that made them look kinder, more patient, more forgiving. And me, I was the complication, the tension, the burden. And I understood. That version was easier to live with, cleaner, simpler. It didn't ask questions or hold up mirrors. For a long minute, I stared at my phone thumb hovering over the reply button. I drafted a response. Facts, screenshots, corrections. I imagined the confrontation, the pushback, the unraveling, and I knew exactly how it would go. "That's not what we meant. You're overthinking. Why are you bringing this up again?" They wouldn't listen to change their minds. They'd listen to confirm them. So I said nothing. Because there's a strange kind of power in choosing not to correct someone's version of you, in letting them sit with the comfort they built while you quietly walk away from it. But once I saw it, really saw it, I couldn't unsee it. They hadn't just stopped including me. They'd replaced me. And now people were starting to believe the version that wasn't even mine. It started as a laugh. Not cruel, not loud, just sharp enough to tilt the air. I was standing near the refreshment table at a networking mixer, the kind where the coffee is bad and everyone's smile is better rehearsed than their follow-up. My cup was half full, thin coffee, more gesture than substance. I was barely listening to Daniel recount some chaotic Thanksgiving story when he turned, still mid-chuckle, and said, "You're probably the kind who ghosts your family on holidays, right?" Then he laughed again, like it wasn't loaded. I smiled too, reflexive, contained, a polite placeholder. But the way his eyes flicked toward Rachel, that was the tell. She didn't say anything, didn't look at me. just nodded slowly and reached for her drink like nothing had landed wrong. The air cooled, not dramatically, just enough that I noticed. Later that night, I found the rest of the thread. I was slipping into my coat in the hallway searching for a lost charger when I heard Rachel's voice. On the phone, clear, conversational, unbothered. No, she's sharp. Always has been. Just intense. You know, family stuff. There it was. I stepped into view. Her smile appeared instantly polished, automatic. Too smooth to be real. I walked home with something tight between my ribs, not fear, not anger. Just recognition. Familiar, inherited. The kind of tension I used to feel behind closed doors, now wearing a blazer and heels. It had crossed over. The soft narratives, the half-true disclaimers, the curated versions of me, they had left the house. And now they had an audience. In the weeks that followed, I watched the pattern unfold with uncomfortable precision. A collaborator who once responded within minutes went quiet. A junior manager I'd mentored grew careful around me like proximity had become risky. I hadn't changed, but the lens they looked through had. And then during a client briefing, someone from the comms team introduced me with a laugh. "Don't worry, she's not as scary as they say." The room chuckled. I chuckled too. But something cold dropped into my chest. That was the third version of that joke I'd heard in 10 days, and I still didn't know who'd said it first. It wasn't the words. It was the tone, familiar, measured, the same one my parents used when explaining me to guests. She's brilliant, but she's focused, but cold. She just has a lot on her mind. They weren't insults, they were disclaimers, subtle ways to prepare people for a version of me I hadn't signed off on, a preemptive justification for whatever came next. That's what made them dangerous. I met with Professor Alden that week, one of the few mentors who still called to check in. Over lunch, he set his fork down and asked gently, "Off the record, is everything okay with your family? I heard there was some kind of falling out." I blinked. "Where did you hear that?" He shrugged. "Oh, you know how these things travel. Just making sure you're okay. Family stuff has a way of following you, especially in our circles." He meant it with care, but it still landed like a verdict. That night, I stood in my kitchen staring at my calendar. I noticed the canceled invites, the one-sentence replies, the absence of warmth in emails that used to feel familiar. The shift wasn't obvious. It was quiet. A subtle reclassification from respected to complicated. I hadn't said anything, but somehow I was already the story. I saw my name in forwarded threads. I wasn't being addressed. I was being referenced. Not as a person, as a caution, a question mark, a rumor. And it wasn't about the truth. It was about repetition. The same phrases returned like echoes. She's intense. She means well. She's just a little closed off, polite enough to pass, vague enough to spread. I thought about pushing back, posting something, asking to clarify. But I knew how that would go. I'd be accused of being defensive, of overthinking, of confirming the very image they had painted, because the brilliance of these stories was that they didn't need to be accurate. They only needed to feel familiar. So I didn't fight them. I watched the consequences arrive quietly. A partnership I'd been building was reconsidered. A panel I was set to moderate was reassigned, no explanation, just an unfortunately at the top of the email. It wasn't rejection. It was a soft removal. I was still welcome, just no longer essential. But this time I didn't flinch. I took inventory of who hesitated before saying my name, of who spoke with certainty but no context, of who borrowed the old family script and recited it in new rooms. She's brilliant, but she's great when she's not. And then just as quietly, something shifted. Not everyone believed it. There were rooms where my work spoke louder than the commentary, where results mattered more than personality, where people read the whole report, not just the footnotes. In those rooms, I wasn't difficult. I was precise. I wasn't intense. I was consistent. I wasn't cold. I was prepared. Those rooms weren't built on charm. They were built on proof. That was power, not the loud kind, the kind that couldn't be whispered away. And the more I leaned into it, the more I saw something no rumor could erase. Performance outlasts perception. Over time, stories built on soft lies start to buckle under hard evidence, so I stopped correcting the version of me they passed around. I just made sure it never entered the room before I did, because in the places where I'd already earned my name, their story didn't stand a chance. By 7:43 in the morning, I had already reviewed 3 briefings, flagged 2 contract inconsistencies, and greenlit an internal restructuring memo that would affect 42 employees across 2 departments. None of this was unusual. Tuesdays were like that. Precise, dense, no room for emotional noise. I sipped coffee that had gone cold an hour ago and scrolled through the next agenda item, noting that a client had requested to renegotiate terms on a partnership we'd already stretched thin. I clicked the document open, adjusted 2 clauses, and typed a short response to legal. No drama, no delay. Decisions here had timelines, consequences, real ones. That was the rule. At 8:25, the conference room filled like clockwork. There was no announcement, no pomp, no waiting for me to speak first. They knew what to bring. They knew what I needed. Most of them had worked with me long enough to trust that silence meant I was thinking, not wavering. Nadine, our operations lead, looked at me once during the numbers review. "You want to hold on to funding Group C?" I nodded. "For now. Let finance reproject post Q3. She noted it down. No pushback, no second-guessing. These weren't people who asked for context every 10 minutes. They knew where to aim, and they trusted that I did too. After the meeting, I passed 2 team leads in the hallway, debating how to handle a potential vendor collapse. They paused when they saw me, not out of deference, but focus. "Do we pivot now or wait?" one asked. I considered it for 2 seconds. "Now. We've waited long enough. Build the bridge today before we need to cross it blind." They nodded left and didn't ask more. There was no need for titles in these halls. The authorities didn't scream here. It functioned. Quietly. Consistently. Around 10:40, HR sent over a review package for a mid-level promotion. I opened the candidate file, skimmed through qualifications, cross-checked team feedback, and approved. She'd been ready for months. Her supervisor had just been too cautious. I clicked send. That one decision would change her salary, her role, and probably how she saw herself. That's what no one outside this building ever saw. The weight, the ripple, the hundreds of moments a week where someone's future sat in a folder on my screen waiting for my name to move it forward. It didn't overwhelm me anymore, but I never forgot the scale. Around noon, I got a message from my mother. A recipe link followed by "Thought of you. Haven't made this in years, remember?" I stared at it for a long second. No question mark, no context, just a soft knock on a door I no longer kept open. I didn't reply. At 12:08, Nadine pinged me. Vendor B had pulled out. We needed to regroup. I closed the message from my mother, muted the thread, and walked back into work mode. By 2 in the afternoon, I was leading a strategy call with international partners. The budget review needed to align with legal constraints across 4 countries. While I was negotiating a solution to a compliance clause that would affect 3 subsidiaries, a cousin I hadn't spoken to in 2 years posted a throwback photo of a family vacation and tagged everyone but me. I noticed it later. Shrugged. Went back to reviewing data privacy language in a shared document draft that could trigger fines if done incorrectly. That was the split. One side sending nostalgia and omissions, the other requiring decisions with legal teeth. My attention had to stay where it counted. There was a time I used to try to share. When I first took on the role, I remember telling my parents about an early win, something small but important to me. I watched them smile politely, then shift the topic back to Evan's travel plans. I'd mentioned a successful negotiation once during a call with my mother. She replied, "That sounds stressful. Maybe you should slow down." I stopped trying after that. Not out of spite, just clarity. There's no point holding out connection to someone who isn't reaching back. At 3:14, an email landed in my inbox. Subject line, "Request exec availability next Friday." It was from our board liaison. A meeting private high-level select only about an acquisition we'd been tracking quietly for months. The timing overlapped with a weekend the family was planning something based on another message I had ignored earlier. I marked the calendar. Didn't think twice. These 2 timelines didn't cross. They hadn't in years. What startled me wasn't the absence of their curiosity, it was how irrelevant that absence had become. I looked around the room at people who brought problems and trusted me with their outcomes, at metrics I could change with a sentence, at systems I had built and kept running, and I realized no one here needed my story to be palatable. They just needed it to work. That was the space I had carved. No apologies, no credentials recited over and over, just results. And the people who mattered here respected the results. By 5, I'd signed off on 3 hiring packages, resolved a cross-departmental misalignment, and confirmed a closed-door roundtable for Q4. The day was done technically, but I stayed an hour longer to finish a memo I didn't want handed off. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't broadcast. Quiet work wasn't invisible here. It was respected. I didn't reply to the recipe message. I didn't send a photo of my office. I didn't explain that today I'd approved decisions that would influence budgets across multiple regions. They wouldn't ask, and I wouldn't offer. Not because I was hiding anything, but because their version of me didn't have space for this life, and I'd stopped trying to squeeze it in. At 6:23, my calendar pinged with the confirmation. Friday, 9:30 a.m. Executive Evaluation Panel. That was the language they used when it mattered most. It wasn't urgent, but it wasn't optional. I noted the time, closed my laptop, and sat back. Another piece in motion, another room prepared. I thought briefly about what they were probably doing right now. Maybe setting the table, maybe texting about weekend plans. I imagined my name hadn't come up. That was fine. They didn't know what I did. They didn't ask. And for the first time, I realized I didn't need them to. I used to think I stayed quiet to protect something. Now I knew better. Silence wasn't retreating. It was a strategy. It wasn't hiding. It was controlled. They thought I was distant because I didn't care. The truth was, I was carrying a life they never bothered to ask about. The message came in on a Thursday. No greeting, no context, just a clipped, efficient line from my mother. "Do you have time to look at something for your brother?" There was no "Hi, Violet," no "How are you?" Not even a mention of what had passed between us, or more accurately, what hadn't. I read it twice then, once more, not out of confusion, but because of how unsurprising it was. After everything, this was how it began. Not with recognition, but with a request. I didn't respond right away. I let it sit. 3 hours later, she followed up. "It's just a quick thing. He needs a second opinion. You're good at this stuff." This stuff. No specifics. No acknowledgement that they hadn't spoken to me in weeks. No mention of birthdays, skipped messages, ignored holidays. I watched unfold online like a spectator. I wasn't being welcomed back. I was being consulted. I asked for details. She sent a document poorly formatted, vaguely labeled, related to a business pitch Evan had apparently been preparing. A draft proposal riddled with red flags, amateur phrasing, and unrealistic projections. It wasn't an easy fix, and yet the assumption baked into every message was clear. I would help. I would know how. I always did. That was my place. Not as a daughter or a sister, but as a silent, convenient resource. The language never changed, only softened. "We were just hoping you could take a quick look. You've always been better with these things. It's really important to him." I scanned the message threads, noting the careful avoidance of emotion. No one said please. No one said thank you. They spoke an expectation the way people speak to something they've already decided belongs to them. I realized then that in their minds I hadn't left. I had simply stepped aside until they needed me again. It became clear quickly that the issue wasn't small. Evan was vying for a position on a startup advisory board, and the application package he'd submitted would have been dismissed by any serious panel. He needed credibility, he needed polish, and apparently he needed me. But not my presence, not my voice in the room, just my input, my revisions, my expertise. No one asked if I was busy. No one acknowledged that the timeline was tight or that the stakes were high. They framed it as a favor to him, not a burden for me. My dad even sent a message. "You're good at these kinds of documents. It would mean a lot to your brother." There was a pause, then another message. "It's just this one thing." Of course it was never just one thing. I'd seen this pattern before. They didn't need me. They needed what I could do. What caught me off guard wasn't the ask. It was the complete, effortless erasure of everything that had come before. No reconciliation, no reflection. Just a casual re-entry into the dynamic where I quietly fixed things, made them look good, and made myself disappear. The moment I saw Evan's name on the draft, something shifted. I remembered the graduation list, the whispers behind closed doors, the version of me they'd spread, the one that was complicated, tense, difficult. And now here I was being asked to make that version irrelevant, but only behind the scenes. They didn't want to be seen with me. They just wanted to benefit from me. I didn't say no, not outright. I said, I can take a look, but I'll need clarity on scope and timeline. The reaction was immediate. My mother replied with, "We're not asking for anything crazy." My father added, "This isn't about being formal, Violet. It's just family." And Evan, for the first time, chimed in directly. "I didn't think it needed to be a whole process. You either want to help or you don't." There it was. The moment they realized the dynamic had shifted. I wasn't declining, I was defining. And in their eyes, that was defiance. The guilt started slowly. My mom sent a message late that night. "He's just under a lot of pressure. We didn't know who else to ask." Then came the call back to bloodlines. "You've always been the one who understands. Don't let old stuff get in the way." Not a single sentence about the old stuff itself, just the implication that it should be buried because now they needed something. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I adjusted the document within the boundaries I set. No overhauls, no guarantees, just clean revisions and a clear note on next steps. I didn't join the calls. I didn't attach my name. I submitted it to a consultant. Neutral, precise, invisible. The update came 3 days later. My mom texted. "They said it went really well. The changes made a big difference. No attribution, no credit, no gratitude, and somehow still a quiet undertone of dissatisfaction. Because it hasn't been easy. I hadn't been immediate. I hadn't offered myself freely completely like I used to." Later that week, I received a call from my aunt. I let it ring. She left a voicemail, her tone wrapped in a smile that didn't reach her words. "You've changed, you know. You used to be so easy to talk to, so helpful." I deleted the message. Not out of anger, out of clarity. They weren't upset because I'd done anything wrong. They were upset because I wasn't easy to use anymore. And yet before the chapter closed, there it was. The next breadcrumb, a message from my father. "There's a family dinner coming up. Evan's got some exciting news to share. It would be great if you could make it." I didn't respond. 5 hours later, another message arrived. "Just something low-key. Everyone will be there." They still hadn't asked what I'd been working on, still hadn't acknowledged what I'd carried, still hadn't realized that being needed and being wanted were not the same. They didn't reach out because they missed me. They reached out because they needed what I could do without needing me in the room. On Monday morning, I quietly removed myself from the shared inbox that the family had started using for all correspondence related to Evan's advisory board pitch. I didn't announce it. I didn't explain. I just copied the necessary documents, created a secure handoff protocol, and assigned a new point of contact, a mid-tier project consultant who specialized in public funding narratives. Her name was Lauren. She was capable, neutral, and unfamiliar with any of the emotional minefields surrounding our last name. I briefed her once, flagged the deadlines, and then stepped back. It was such a small move that no one noticed it right away. There was no disruption, no broken chain of communication, just a gentle reroute of information and authority. Within 48 hours, the pitch flow moved through formal channels. No more text threads, no more last-minute documents, no more, "Can you just take a quick look?" requests slipping into my phone at midnight. From the outside, everything looked the same, but internally the center of gravity had shifted. By Wednesday, a senior policy advisor from an adjacent department had been looped in. I didn't name drop. I didn't escalate. I simply shared the updated draft with a discreet professional note. "Relevant to the funding model we discussed, please advise on feasibility." The reply came within the hour, clear and surgical. "Several assumptions are misaligned. This would benefit from a financial risk audit." I thanked him, forwarded the message, attached it to the board prep packet. No embellishments, no summary from me. It worked the way well-built systems do, quietly, efficiently, without relying on personality. And most importantly, it left no room for manipulation. The first crack showed up in my brother's voice during a check-in call with Lauren, which she later summarized for me in a debrief. He said things are moving too slowly, asked if someone could just help him get this through. I told her to stay the course. That was the point. No more backdoors, no more name shielding. If Evan wanted the role, he'd have to walk the full path. Paper trail committee review, objective feedback. By Friday, the discomfort started leaking through. My mother texted, "Any way to move things faster," followed quickly by, "Feels like it's getting a bit rigid." I replied with a single sentence, "It's following the required process." No smiley face, no added softness. I wasn't cold. I was being clear. What they didn't understand or refused to see was that this wasn't me withholding help. It was me removing myself from the middle. I wasn't blocking Evan's progress. I was refusing to carry it for him. For the first time in what I assumed had been years, Evan had to explain his ideas in his own words, not with my polish layered over them. He had to sit in rooms where my quiet credibility no longer buffered his performance. I wasn't protecting him from scrutiny. I wasn't prepping his answers. I wasn't smoothing over edges behind the scenes. And I didn't say a word about it. I let the new structure speak for itself. The discomfort turned into subtle blame. My dad called and left a message. "Just wondering if you're still involved. It's starting to feel a bit different." Different meant slower, measured, documented, professional. My mother sent a follow-up. "Evan says the committee's asking questions he doesn't feel prepared for." "Any thoughts?" I responded. "He can request a prep session with Lauren." The reply came quickly. "It's just this used to be easier when you handled it." Exactly. At dinner the following Sunday, a casual thing as they'd put it, I arrived on time and stayed quiet. My presence was expected, not necessarily welcomed. Evan glanced at me twice and said nothing. My mother asked about the weather. My father brought up a documentary. No one mentioned the process shift. But the tension had a shape now, and it was resting in the center of the table. Halfway through the meal, Evan leaned over and asked, "So are you just not involved anymore?" I looked at him neutral. "Everything's where it needs to be. You have the right support." He blinked. "Right. But don't you think it'd be better if—" I didn't let him finish. "You're the applicant, Evan. The process should reflect that." I returned to my food. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't look at anyone else. The silence that followed wasn't mine to carry. A few days later, Lauren forwarded me a message from the advisory board's review coordinator. Evan had missed a deadline for supplemental documents. The response was firm but fair. "We cannot proceed without this material." I didn't intervene. I didn't rescue. Instead, I watched the same tension they had always assigned to me begin to settle into their own shoulders. Missed emails, ambiguous instructions, delayed responses. The process wasn't failing. It was simply functioning without a fallback. Without me. My mother texted again. "Is something wrong?" "Things feel off," I replied. "It's all moving according to policy." I didn't elaborate. I didn't soothe. I redirected. That week, my father asked to have a quick word. The conversation started with small talk, circled once around Evan's frustrations, then landed at the real question. "Why aren't you helping more?" I looked at him evenly. "I am. I put systems in place. I ensured he had support. I redirected everything so that it didn't rely on me personally." He frowned. "But you used to be easier," I asked not unkindly. He didn't answer. The days that followed were quieter, not in the sense of peace, but pressure, the kind that builds slowly measured by small consequences. Questions Evan couldn't answer, deadlines he had to manage, decisions he couldn't delay. There was no villain, just the absence of shortcuts. And for the first time, that absence had weight. By the end of the week, a formal review was scheduled. A panel, documents already submitted, assessment criteria locked in. I wasn't on the calendar, but my fingerprints were everywhere. They didn't say it, but I could feel it. The ground had shifted. The ease with which they once moved, assumed, asked, it was gone. In its place was something firmer, less pliable. Not opposition, just structure. For the first time, I wasn't absorbing the tension. I was placing it exactly where it belonged. It came from my cousin Rebecca, not from a competitor, not from someone I'd wronged, from someone who had smiled at me across holiday tables for 30 years and never once made me feel like I needed to watch my back. The email landed in my inbox on a Tuesday afternoon, forwarded by mistake. It was a thread I wasn't supposed to see past between Rebecca and my mother, with a subject line that read, "Violet situation." I clicked it open, not because I suspected anything, but because I thought it might be about logistics, planning, something small. Instead, I read 8 messages spanning 2 weeks discussing how to handle me. "She's gotten harder to deal with," my mother had written. "I don't know what happened to her, but she's not the same." Rebecca had replied with a tone I recognized from corporate boardrooms, measured, strategic. Maybe it's time to stop asking her for help altogether. She clearly doesn't want to be part of this family anymore. Let her sit with that. There was more. A discussion about whether to invite me to Thanksgiving. A suggestion that I might cause a scene if confronted. A note from Rebecca saying she'd heard from a mutual contact in the industry that I was difficult to work with, and maybe that explained things. I sat in my office chair, the leather creaking under me, and read every word. Then I read it again. Rebecca had never worked with me. She was a regional sales manager for a furniture chain. Our professional paths had never crossed. But somewhere between family dinners and overheard gossip, she had decided she knew enough to speak on my character. And my mother had listened. I thought about the last time I saw Rebecca, 3 months earlier at a birthday party for her youngest. I'd brought a gift, stayed an hour, smiled when prompted, and left without incident. She hugged me at the door and said, "We should catch up more often." Now I understood what she meant. The betrayal didn't feel sharp, it felt slow. Like watching a bridge you thought was solid reveal its rot one plank at a time. I had grown used to being misunderstood by my immediate family. But Rebecca had always been on the periphery, someone I thought existed outside the story they told. She didn't. She was a supporting actor who had been rehearsing her lines the whole time. I didn't respond to the email. I didn't forward it. I didn't screenshot it and send it to anyone. I simply closed it, archived it in a folder I labeled evidence, and went back to work. That night, I sat in my living room and let the weight of it settle. It wasn't grief. It wasn't a shock. It was recognition. The same recognition I'd felt when I heard my mother on that voicemail. The same recognition I'd felt when I found the message in my cousin Lucas's chat. The story didn't just live inside my parents' house. It had multiplied. It had spread through bloodlines and into corners I hadn't thought to guard. And the worst part wasn't that they believed it. It was that they never once asked me if it was true. For days afterward, I considered confrontation. I imagined calling Rebecca, asking her directly what she'd meant, demanding an explanation. But every scenario ended the same way, with her voice softening into defense, with phrases like, "I didn't mean it like that," and "You're taking this the wrong way." The script was already written. I knew it by heart. So instead of pushing back, I did something quieter. I pulled away from the extended family entirely. I declined the next 3 invitations without explanation. I stopped responding to group texts. I didn't announce my absence. I just stopped showing up. And then I watched. It took 2 weeks for someone to notice. My aunt texted first. "Haven't heard from you in a while. Is everything okay?" I replied with something polite and vague. She didn't follow up. Then came Rebecca. A message that read, "Hey stranger, miss you at these things. Hope you're doing well." I didn't respond at all. Within a month, the story had shifted again. I wasn't just distant now. I was cold, unreachable, punishing the family for something no one could name, and I let them believe it. Because the truth was, I wasn't punishing anyone. I was simply done pretending that proximity meant safety, done assuming that blood meant loyalty, done believing that people who smiled at me across tables weren't sharpening their words in private. Rebecca never apologized. She probably never thought she had anything to apologize for, and maybe in her version of the story she didn't. But in mine, she was the final proof that the betrayal wasn't coming from strangers. It was coming from inside the house. The people I had trusted the longest were the ones who had been rewriting me the most, and the only way to stop being their story was to stop being their audience. I almost missed it. The comment sat at the bottom of a document I'd been reviewing for days, buried beneath tracked changes and polite suggestions that softened everything until it meant nothing. I was focused on structured deadlines, the kind of edits that keep a project moving without drawing attention. Then one sentence stopped me cold. This section assumes intent without evidence. Recommend revising to reflect observable actions only. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't personal. It didn't reference anyone by name. It was just accurate. And in a document full of careful hedging, that accuracy felt like resistance. The name attached to it was Claire Winters. I knew her only distantly: policy analysis, different division, a reputation for being exact without being loud. We'd crossed paths in meetings, exchanged a few emails over the years. She was competent, unobtrusive, the kind of person who did solid work and didn't seem interested in visibility. I stared at her comment longer than I meant to, not because I disagreed, but because it cut through something I'd grown used to navigating: implication tone, the subtle pressure to phrase things so no one felt uncomfortable. Claire hadn't done that. She hadn't padded the truth. She'd simply named it. Later that afternoon, on my way to a meeting, I slowed outside her office. The door was open. She was at her desk, sleeves rolled up, scanning a spreadsheet, with the kind of concentration that made interruptions feel rude even before they happened. I hesitated, then spoke anyway. "Your note on Section 4, I said. "Did you mean that literally? Or was there something else you were pointing to?" She looked up without surprise, like she hadn't assumed the comment would go unnoticed, but hadn't expected thanks either. "I meant it literally," she said. "The language assigns motive where we only have behavior. If this goes to review, that'll be a problem. No qualifiers, no softening. Just a statement of fact." "Thanks," I said. She nodded once and turned back to her screen. I walked away with a strange, weightless feeling. She hadn't asked for context. She hadn't tried to read me. She hadn't offered support or curiosity. She'd treated the issue as what it was: a problem of accuracy. For someone who had spent years being interpreted, that neutrality felt almost disorienting. Back at my desk, I opened the document again. Another comment had appeared, also from Claire. "Let's avoid assigning motivation here. Stick to what's documented." It wasn't just editing. It was a principle, a line she wasn't willing to cross, regardless of whose name sat on the cover. That evening, the office thinned out. Emails slowed. The building took on that quiet hum it only gets after hours when no one is performing anymore. I reopened the document, reading her comments again, letting them land. They weren't about me, and somehow that made them matter more. I opened a private message thread and typed, "Thanks for the notes in Section 3. They made a difference." Her reply came quickly. "Happy to contribute. It's easier to just do the right thing." No warmth, no explanation. Just a statement that felt less like reassurance and more like a boundary. The next morning, I arrived early. I liked the building before it filled up, when the hallways felt honest. As the document loaded, I noticed another name in the comments: Malik Hassan Compliance. His note was just as clean. This phrasing implies causation where there's only correlation. Recommend revision. I leaned back in my chair, exhaled slowly. 2 comments, 2 people. Neither of them had framed their input as help. Neither had asked permission to be precise. They'd simply refused to let assumptions pass as fact. It wasn't a movement. It wasn't even a conversation. But it was the first time in months I felt the ground under my feet steady. In the days that followed, the collaboration shifted almost imperceptibly. Language tightened, claims sharpened. The document began to feel less like a performance and more like a record. And in that shift, something inside me relaxed. I wasn't guarding every sentence anymore. I wasn't preemptively explaining. The work was carrying itself. One afternoon, I ran into Claire in the hallway outside the elevators. She was holding a stack of binders, clearly headed somewhere else. "I saw Malik's note," she said casually, as if commenting on the weather. Good catch. I nodded. Yeah, it matters. She adjusted the binders in her arms. It always does. There was no shared look, no implication. Just agreement on a standard. As the elevator doors closed, I realized how rare that was alignment without alliance support, without strings. Later that week, we ended up at the same table in the cafeteria. It wasn't planned. The place was crowded, the kind of midday rush that forces proximity. We ate in silence for a few minutes, the clatter of trays filling the space. Then she said, without looking up, "People think being precise is political." I smiled faintly. "It usually is," she shrugged. "Only if you care who it benefits." She glanced at me then briefly. "I don't." There it was. Not a confession, not a bond, just a line she'd drawn for herself long before I entered the picture. At that moment, I understood why she'd seen the issue so clearly. It wasn't about me. It was about her refusal to trade truth for ease. Walking back to my office, I felt something unfamiliar bloom relief, yes, but also clarity. There's a difference between allies who stand with you because it serves them and people who stand with the truth even when no one's watching. I'd had the first. This was the second. And the difference mattered more than I'd realized. By the end of the week, I reorganized the revision plan, not as a statement, not as a reward. Claire would handle the sections where inference risk was highest. Malik would review causation claims. It made sense. Skill to task, principle to responsibility. I didn't send thank you emails. I didn't frame it as solidarity. The work spoke, and they answered. That Friday evening, I stayed late finishing a final pass. The document felt solid now, not because it was polished, but because it was honest. I closed my laptop and sat there for a moment, listening to the building settle. I thought about all the rooms I'd walked into, carrying someone else's version of me, all the energy I'd spent bracing for misinterpretation. And then I thought about Claire's comment. One line, no fanfare, just a refusal to look away. She hadn't defended me. She hadn't taken my side. She hadn't even acknowledged there was a side to take. She'd simply held the line where it mattered. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something loosen in my chest. I wasn't explaining myself into a void anymore. Someone had seen what was actually there, and they hadn't needed me to make a case for it. In a world built on implication and comfort, that kind of clarity felt radical. And quietly, without announcement, it changed everything. The room was quiet before anything happened. Chairs filled slowly, laptops opened without urgency. Coffee cups lined the edge of the table like small sentinels. I sat in the second row, not at the head, not in the spotlight, just another seat among many. The agenda had been circulated, the names had been confirmed. There was nothing unusual about the morning except the weight I felt pressing against my ribs as I watched the door. Evan walked in at 9:28, 4 minutes early, which was unusual for him. He carried himself the way he always did. Confidence. Easy, like the room had already decided in his favor and was just waiting to make it official. He smiled at the coordinator, nodded to a few familiar faces, sat down directly across from where I was sitting without once looking in my direction. He didn't know I was on the panel. The chair called the meeting to order at 9:32. The introduction was procedural. Names were confirmed, roles were stated. And then the HR representative looked up from her notes and said with no particular emphasis, "Before we continue, I want to clarify the structure of today's review. Ms. Violet Thompson has been appointed as an official evaluator and co-chair for this session." The room didn't gasp. No one clapped. But I watched my brother's face change. It was subtle. A slight pause in his breathing, a flicker behind his eyes. The smile he had worn into the room didn't disappear, but it thinned, like he was suddenly aware of something he hadn't calculated. He looked at me for the first time. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I just met his gaze and held it. The meeting proceeded. Questions were asked. Documents were referenced. Projections were reviewed. And with each passing minute, the room adjusted, not to me as a person, but to me as a presence with authority. People who had once spoken over me now paused before interjecting. People who had dismissed my contributions in other settings now waited for my comments before moving forward. It wasn't personal. It was procedural. And that was exactly the point. Evan answered questions the way he always did, with charm, with confidence, with carefully rehearsed phrases that sounded good but lacked depth. In other rooms, that might have been enough. But this room was built on metrics, on evidence, on documented outcomes, and charm doesn't survive scrutiny. By mid-morning, the panel had flagged 3 inconsistencies in his proposal. 2 of them were structural. 1 was financial. Each time he tried to explain. Each time his explanations fell short. Not because he was lying, but because he hadn't done the work. He had assumed someone else would fill in the gaps for him. That someone had always been me. I didn't intervene. I didn't rescue. I asked the same questions I would have asked of any applicant. I held him to the same standard I held everyone else. And when his answers came up short, I let the silence do the rest. By noon, the evaluation was complete. Recommendations were drafted. Follow-up items were noted. And when the chair declared the meeting adjourned, Evan stood up slowly, like his legs had forgotten how to move. He didn't look at me again. Later that afternoon, I received a message from the HR coordinator. "Thank you for your contributions today. The panel appreciated your clarity." That was all. No drama, no applause, just acknowledgement of work done well. But as I walked out of the building that evening, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not satisfied, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when you stop holding up a weight that was never yours to carry. They had built a version of me that was small, difficult, disposable. And today the room had adjusted to the truth. The room was empty by the time I returned to it. Chairs, pushed back screens dimmed the scent of strong coffee fading into the neutral air. A trace of tension still lingered like the static after a storm, but it was quieter now. Not charged, not sharp, just the aftermath of something that had fully played out. I didn't linger for long. There was nothing left to absorb, no need to replay the meeting or dissect the looks exchanged. This wasn't a climax, it was the unceremonious return of silence, a reset. By the next morning, everything had shifted in the only way that mattered. It had normalized. The system, ever hungry for the next task, had moved on. Files were archived, forms submitted, recommendations routed through proper channels. My brother's application, once laced with implication, became what it always should have been, just another name in a stack of many. No special note, no whispered legacy, just data reviewed by professionals with no emotional skin in the game. I didn't ask about the outcome. I didn't track it. I didn't need to. The point had never been to win. The point was to hold the line. The first call from home came that afternoon. My mother's voice was quieter than usual. Not brittle, not even upset, just careful, like she wasn't sure who I was now. "Violet," she began, then paused. "That thing yesterday, was that real?" She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. "It was a formal process," I replied. My voice didn't rise. No sharpness, no invitation. There was silence on her end, the kind that tries to rewrite itself mid-sentence. We just didn't know. I let the silence return. Eventually she offered a rushed goodbye, and the line went dead. No resolution, no false closeness. And for the first time that felt exactly right. My brother called a few days later. The swagger was gone. Not replaced with humility, just a kind of raw confusion, like the story he'd expected to be in, had been rewritten without his input. So he said, "Did you know this was going to happen?" I knew what the process was. I said simply. He let out a breath. "You could have said something." I considered that. It wasn't my place. There was a long pause, not angry, just unfamiliar. He wasn't used to me choosing silence when he wanted a soft landing. But this wasn't about punishment. It was about precision. I had done what I needed to do. Nothing more, nothing less. He didn't push. And for the first time, I didn't fill the quiet. That was the real shift. Not the meeting, not the visible reversal of power. But what came afterward, the silence from the family machine that had for so long spun discomfort into distraction. No one reframed it. No one rescued him. No one suggested I was being unfair. He had to sit with the outcome, alone. And he didn't know how. A week later an apology came, or at least the shape of one. My aunt called. The cadence was too smooth, like it had been practiced in a mirror. If we ever made you feel less than, she said, trailing off before landing anywhere real that wasn't our intention. I listened. I didn't correct it. I didn't unearth every buried moment that phrase tried to erase. When she finished, I said, I appreciate you reaching out. That was it. She waited maybe for forgiveness, maybe for reassurance that nothing had really changed. I gave her neither. Instead, I began to set boundaries, not through confrontation, through absence. I stopped replying to messages that weren't directed at me. I didn't offer updates. I didn't justify missed gatherings or explain my silence. When asked a direct question, I answered directly, briefly, completely. And then I stopped talking. The distance between my brother and me settled into a shape that required no maintenance. We didn't argue. We didn't reconcile. We simply moved through separate orbits, no longer pretending we belonged to the same system. Work filled the days with rhythm, purpose, neutral spaces where my voice wasn't filtered through family narratives or old expectations. I didn't have to explain the past to be heard. I didn't have to overperform to be respected. The rooms I walked into now met me where I was not where someone else said I should be. Relationships shifted as they always do. Some leaned in, some faded. No drama, no collapse, just recalibration. And within that quiet, I found a strange peace. Not triumph, not vindication, just clarity. The kind you don't need to perform for, the kind that doesn't seek approval, the kind that simply is. Power hadn't made me louder. It hadn't made me ruthless. It had made me clear. And in that clarity, I discovered the final truth. I didn't need to change anyone's mind. I didn't need to undo the stories they told. I didn't even need them to see me differently, because now I had a choice. Not about revenge, not about redemption, but about space, about where I showed up and where I no longer needed to. Power didn't change who I was. It just removed everyone who needed me to stay small. The sun had already cleared the buildings when I poured the first cup of coffee. Nothing remarkable in the light that spilled across the countertop. Nothing urgent waiting to unfold. Just the soft rhythm of the city stretching awake bus brakes, sighing birds jostling for space overhead, the echo of a door closing somewhere down the hall. I sat at the table with both hands around the mug and noticed something I hadn't felt in a long time. Stillness without dread. There was no checklist unfurling in my mind, no silent rehearsal for conversations I might have to navigate. Just a rare, unguarded quiet. It wasn't a victory anyone else would see, but for me it was enough. The message came mid-sip. If you're free tonight, dinner's at 7. No preamble. No emotional weight strung between the lines. Just an open sentence. Years ago, I might have studied the wording, looked for what wasn't being said, asked myself if this was an olive branch or a trap. This time I read it once and set the phone down. Not with resentment, just with finality. Out the window, a small crowd had begun to gather at the bus stop. People in jackets and wrinkled shirts moving toward their own stories, none of which needed my interpretation. I watched them for a while and thought about the roles we're assigned long before we understand the cost. The diplomat, the absorber, the one who makes herself small so no one else has to shift. I'd lived inside that script, but it was no longer mine. I deleted the message, not to make a point, just because I could. The morning unfolded as it always did. I drove to work with the windows cracked, letting in the sound of pavement under tires, the flicker of air that didn't carry expectation. No inner arguments, no self-edits. The day belonged to itself. At my desk, the inbox blinked calmly. Tasks lined up in orderly rows. No one asked where I'd been. No one hinted at histories I hadn't offered. They asked for timelines for deliverables. For clarity. That was the difference now. I wasn't being measured against whispers. I was being met in the present. Around noon, a text arrived from my brother. About earlier. Just want you to know I meant no disrespect. It wasn't an apology, just a test. A gentle knock to see if the door still opened the same way. I didn't respond. Not out of coldness, but because I'd learned to tell the difference between repair and rehearsal. Some doors aren't meant to close loudly. They're just not meant to swing on the same hinges forever. I had lunch with a colleague, a quiet one, who only knew me through timelines and team chats. We spoke about process flow and design bugs over steaming bowls of pho. The conversation didn't dip into metaphor. It didn't carry a hidden meaning. And somehow that simplicity felt more intimate than anything I'd had to decipher. Afterward, I wandered into a bookstore without intention. I trailed my fingers along unfamiliar spines. A woman nearby asked what I thought of a cover design. I gave an honest answer. She smiled, said thanks, and moved on. That was all. And it was enough. That evening I cooked slowly. Roasted vegetables, herbed rice lemon water in a heavy glass. The scent of garlic and rosemary rose through the apartment like something remembered. When I sliced into the carrots, the knife made a soft tap against the plate, a clean, percussive sound that belonged only to that moment. I ate at the same kitchen table where I'd read the message that morning. But now, the quiet has changed shape. It wasn't absent. It was space. Room to inhabit myself fully. No notifications blinked. No questions hovered. Nothing demanded that I justify my peace. I didn't raise a glass. But if I had, it would have been to this, a life that doesn't need footnotes. Later, I opened my laptop and began outlining a new project. One rooted in subtleties, in stillness, in truths that didn't need to crescendo to be real. I wasn't writing for validation. I wasn't reclaiming anything. I was simply telling the truth as it stood without armor. When I closed the laptop, the apartment had grown darker. No messages, no follow-ups, no one pressed for the version of me they were more comfortable with. And that, too, was peace. I didn't need to sit at a table that had always required me to be half of myself. I didn't need to reclaim a seat I was never meant to fit in. I had chosen my own. And in the quiet it held. If you've ever had to make yourself small to stay in the room, if you've ever been asked to carry silence so others could stay comfortable, then maybe you understand. Tell me, would you go back to that table, or would you build your own? And if this kind of quiet strength speaks to you, stay.